Chapter 13, Underland without the Queen. Now, if you remember chapter 12, all of the adventurers had just killed the queen, who had turned, the evil queen, the queen of the Underland, who had just turned herself into a green snake. Remember that? And they had cut its head off, and they're ready now they're eating some food, and then they're going to make plans for how to get out of the Underland. Chapter 13, Underland without the Queen. All of them felt that they had earned what Scrub called a breather, a bit of a rest. The witch had locked the door and told the Earthmen not to disturb her, so there was no danger of interruption for now. Their first business was, of course, Puddleglum's burnt foot. A couple of clean shirts from the prince's bedroom, torn into strips and well greased on the inside with butter and salad oil off the supper table, made a fairly good dressing for his foot. When this had been applied, they all sat down and ate a little food, had some refreshments, and discussed plans for escaping from the underworld. Rillian explained that there were quite a lot of outlets by which one could get to the surface. He had been taken through most of them at one time or another, but he'd never gone out alone, only with the witch, and he had always reached these outlets by going in a ship across the sunless sea. What the Earthmen would say if he went down to the harbor without the witch and with 4 strangers and simply ordered a ship, no one could guess. But most likely they would ask awkward questions, all right. On the other hand, the new outlet, the one for the invasion of Overworld, was on this side of the sea and only a few miles away. The prince knew that it was nearly finished. Only a few feet of earth divided the diggings from the outer air. It was even possible that by now it had been finished. Perhaps the witch had come back to tell him that and to start the attack. Even if it wasn't quite done, they could probably dig themselves out by that route in a few hours, if they could only get there without being stopped. And if only they found the diggings unguarded. But those were the difficulties, and they didn't sound promising. "Well, if you ask me," began Puddleglum when Scrub interrupted. "I say," he asked, "what is that noise?" "Well, I've been wondering that for some time," said Jill. They had all, in fact, been hearing the noise, but it had begun and increased so gradually that they didn't know when they had first even noticed it. For a while, it had only been a vague disquiet, like gentle winds or maybe traffic that you hear far away and don't really pay attention to it. But then the noise began to swell like a murmur, like the sea, and then came the rumblings and rushings. Now there seemed to be voices as well, and also a steady roaring that was not voices. "By the lion," said Prince Rillian, "it seems this silent land has found a tongue at last." Remember how quiet it was when they were coming through the city? Almost no noise, no yelling, no calling everyone. The prince rose and walked to the window and pulled aside the curtains. The others crowded around him to look out the window. The very first thing they noticed was a great red glow. Its reflection made a red patch on the roof of the underworld, thousands of feet above them, so that they could now see a rocky ceiling which had perhaps been hidden in darkness ever since the world was made. The glow itself came from the far side of the city, so that many buildings, grim and great, stood up blackly against it. But it also cast its light down many streets that ran from it towards the castle, and in those streets something very strange was going on. The closely packed, silent crowds of Earthmen had vanished. Instead, there were figures darting about by 1s or 2s or even 3s. They behaved like people who didn't want to be seen. They were lurking and hiding in shadows behind buttresses or in doorways, and then they would move quickly across open spaces into fresh places of hiding. But the strangest thing of all, to anyone who knew the gnomes, was the noise. Shouts and cries came from all directions, but from the harbor there came a low, rumbling roar which grew steadily louder and was already shaking the whole city. "What's happened to the Earthmen?" said Scrub. "Is it them that are shouting?" "'Tis hardly possible," said the prince. "I never heard one of the rascals so much as speak with a loud voice in all the weary years of my capture here. Some new devilry, I don't doubt." "And what is that red light over there?" asked Jill. "Is something burning? Is something on fire?" "If you ask me," said Puddleglum, "I should say that was the central fires of the earth breaking out to make a new volcano. We'll be in the middle of it, I shouldn't wonder." "Look at that ship," said Scrub. "Why, it's coming so quickly and nobody is rowing it." "Look, look," said the prince. "The ship is already far this side of the harbor. It is in the street. Look, all the ships are driving into the city. By my head, the sea is rising. The flood is upon us. Aslan, be praised. This castle stands on high ground, but the water comes on grimly fast." "Oh, what can be happening?" cried Jill. "Fire and water and all those people dodging around in the streets." "I'll tell you what it is," said Puddleglum. "That witch has laid a train of magic spells, so that whenever she was killed, at that same moment her whole kingdom would fall to pieces. She's the sort that wouldn't so much dying herself if she knew that the chap who killed her was going to be burned or buried or drowned 5 minutes later." "Hast hit it, friend Wiggle," said the prince. "You're absolutely right. When our swords hacked off the witch's head, that stroke ended all her magic works, and now the deep lands are falling to pieces. We are looking on the end of the underworld." "That's it, sir," said Puddleglum, "unless it should happen to be the end of the whole world. But are we just going to stay here and wait?" gasped Jill. "Not by my counsel," said the prince. "I would save my horse, Coal-Black, and the witch's Snowflake, a noble beast and worthy of a better mistress, which are both stabled in the courtyard. After that, let us make quickly to get out to high ground and pray that we shall find an outlet. The horses can carry 2 of us each at need, and if we put them to it, they may outrun the flood." "Will your highness not put on armor?" asked Puddleglum. "I don't like the look of those," and he pointed down to the streets. Everyone looked down. Dozens of creatures, and now that they were close, were obviously Earthmen. They were coming up from the direction of the harbor, but they were not moving like an aimless crowd. They behaved like modern soldiers in an attack, making rushes and taking cover, anxious not to be seen from the castle windows. "I dare not see the inside of that armor again," said the prince. "I rode in it as a movable dungeon, and it stinks of magic and slavery. But I will take the shield." He left the room and returned with a strange light in his eyes a moment later. "Look, friend," he said, holding out the shield towards them. "An hour ago this was black and without device, and now look at this." The shield had turned as bright as silver, and on it, redder than blood or cherries, was the picture of a lion. The lion. "Doubtless," said the prince, "this signifies that Aslan will be our good lord, whether he means us to live or die. And all's one for that. Now, by my counsel, we shall all kneel and kiss his likeness on this shield, and then we will all shake hands one with another as true friends that may shortly be parted. And then let us descend into the city and take the adventure that is sent to us." And so they all did as the prince had said. But when Scrub shook hands with Jill, he said, "So long, Jill. Sorry I've been a funk and so ratty. I hope you get safe home." And Jill said, "So long, Eustace. I'm sorry I've been such a pig." And this was the first time they had ever used Christian names with each other, their first names, because one didn't do that at their school. The prince unlocked the door, and they all went down the stairs, 3 of them with drawn swords and Jill with a drawn knife. The attendants had vanished, and the great room at the foot of the prince's stairs was empty. The gray, doleful, sad-looking lamps were still burning, and by their light they had no difficulty in passing gallery after gallery and descending stairway after stairway. The noises from outside the castle were not so easily heard here as they had been in the room above. Inside the house all was still as death, and it was deserted, nobody around. It was as they turned a corner into the great hall on the ground floor that they met their first Earthman, a fat, whitish creature with a very pig-like face who was gobbling up all the remains of food on the tables there. It squealed. The squeal also sounded very much like that of a pig, and then it darted under a bench, whisking its long tail out of Puddleglum's reach in the nick of time. Then it rushed away through the far door, too quickly to be followed. From the hall they came out into the courtyard. Jill, who went to riding school during her holidays, had just noticed the smell of a stable. A very nice, honest, homely smell it is to meet in a place like Underland. When Eustace said, "Great Scott, look at that!" a magnificent rocket had risen from somewhere beyond the castle walls and was broken into green stars. "It's fireworks," said Jill in a puzzled voice. "Yes," said Eustace, "but you can't imagine those earth people letting them off for fun. It must be a signal of some kind." "And it means no good to us, I'll bet your money," said Puddleglum. "Friends," said the prince, "when once a man is launched on such an adventure as this, he must bid farewell to hopes and fears, otherwise death or deliverance will both come too late to save his honor and his reason. Ho, my beauties!" He was now opening the stable door. "Hey, cousin, steady, Coal-Black, steady now, softly now, Snowflake, you are not forgotten." The horses were both frightened by the strange lights and the noises. Jill, who had been so cowardly about going through a black hole between one cave and another, went in without fear between the stamping and snorting beasts, and she and the prince had them both saddled and bridled in a few minutes. Very fine they looked as they came out into the courtyard, tossing their heads. Jill mounted up on Snowflake, and Puddleglum got up behind her. Eustace got up behind the prince on Coal-Black, and then with a great echo of hoofs, they rode out of the main gateway into the street. "Not much danger of being burnt, that's the bright side of it," observed Puddleglum, pointing to their right. And there, hardly 100 yards away, lapping against the walls of the houses, was water. "Courage," said the prince. "The road there goes down steeply. That water has climbed only half up the greatest hill in the city. It might come so near in the first half hour and come no nearer in the next 2 hours. My fear is more of that," and he pointed with his sword to a great 7-foot earth man with boar's tusks, followed by 6 others of assorted shapes and sizes who had just dashed out of a side street and stepped into the shadow of the house where no one could see them. The prince led the other horse, aiming always in the direction of the glowing red light, but a little to the left of it. His plan was to get around the fire, if it was in fact a fire, and then on to high ground in hopes that they might find their way to the new diggings. Unlike the other 3, he seemed to be almost enjoying himself. He whistled as he rode and sang snatches of an old song about Corn Thunderfist of Archenland. The truth is, he was so very glad at being set free from his long enchantment that all the dangers around him right now seemed like a game in comparison. But the rest found this to be quite an eerie, scary journey. Behind them was the sound of clashing and entangled ships and the rumble of collapsing buildings. Overhead was the great patch of lurid lights on the roof of the underworld. Ahead of them was the mysterious red glow, which did not seem to grow any bigger. From that same direction came a continual hubbub of shouts, screams, catcalls, laughter, squeals, and bellowings, and fireworks of all sorts rose in the dark air. No one could guess what these fireworks meant. Nearer to them, the city was partly lit up by the red glow and partly by the very different lights of the dreary gnome lamps. But there were many places where neither of these lights fell, and those places were jet black. And in and out of those places, the shapes of earthmen were seen to be darting and slipping all the time. All was with their eyes staring at the travelers. All was trying to keep out of sight themselves, but keeping the travelers in their sights. There were big faces and little faces, huge faces like fish's eyes and little eyes like bears'. There were feathers and bristles, horns and tusks, noses like whipcord and chins so long that they looked like beards. Every now and then a group of these would get too big or come too near, and then the prince would brandish his sword and make a show of charging them. And the creatures, with all manners of hootings and squeakings and cluckings, and would dive away into the darkness to escape. But when they had climbed many steep streets and were far away from the flood and almost out of the town on the inland side, it began to be more serious. They were now closer to the red glow and nearly on a level with it, although they could still not see what it really was. But by its light they could see their enemies more clearly. Hundreds, maybe even a few thousand of gnomes were all moving towards it, towards the light, but they were doing so in short rushes, and whenever they stopped, they turned and looked back at the travelers. "If your Highness asked me," said Puddleglum, "I'd say those fellows were meaning to cut us off in front." "Yes, that was my thought too, Puddleglum," said the prince, "and we can never fight our way through so many. Hark you, let us ride forth close by the edge of yonder house, and even as we reach it, you slip into its shadow. The lady and I will then go forward a few paces. Some of those devils will follow us, I doubt not, they are thick behind us. Do you, who have long arms, take one alive, if you may, as it passes your ambush. We might get a true story out of it, or learn from it what their quarrel is against us." "But won't all the others come rushing at us to rescue the one we catch?" said Jill, in a voice not so steady as she tried to make it. She was a little bit afraid. "Then, madam," said the prince, "you shall see us die fighting around you, and you must commend yourself to the lion. Now, good Puddleglum, shall we?" So the Marshwiggle slipped off into the shadow as quickly as a cat. The others, for a sickening minute or so, went forward at a walk, and then suddenly from behind them there broke out a series of blood-curdling screams mixed with the familiar voice of Puddleglum saying, now then, don't cry out before you're hurt, or you will get hurt. See this? Anyone would think it was a pig being killed." "Oh, that was good hunting," exclaimed the prince, immediately turning coal-black around and coming back to the corner of the house. "Eustace," he said, "of your courtesy, take Coal-Black's head." And then he dismounted from his horse, and all three gazed in silence while Puddleglum pulled his catch out into the light. It was a most miserable little gnome, only about 3 feet tall. It had sort of a ridge like you see on top of a rooster's head, only it was hard on the top of its head. Little pink eyes and a mouth and chin so large and round that its face looked like that of a pygmy hippopotamus. If they'd not been in such a tight spot, they would have burst out laughing at the sight of this thing. "Now, Earthman," said the prince, standing over it and holding his sword point very near the prisoner's neck, "speak up like an honest gnome, and you shall go free. But play the idiot with us, and you are but a dead Earthman." "Good, Puddleglum. Now, how can it speak while you hold its mouth tight shut?" "No, and it can't bite either with me holding its mouth shut," said Puddleglum. "If I had the silly soft hands that you humans have, saving your Highness's reverence, I'd have been all over blood by now. Yet even a Marshwiggle gets tired of being chewed." "Sirrah," said Prince to the gnome, "one bite, and you die. Now, let its mouth open, Puddleglum." "Ooh-ee, squeal, squeal, squeal," squealed the Earthman. Let me go, it isn't me, I didn't do it, let me go." "Didn't do what?" asked Puddleglum. "Well, whatever your honors say I did do," answered the creature. "Tell me your name," said the prince, "and what you Earthmen are all about today." "Oh, please, your honors, please, kind gentlemen," whimpered the gnome. "Promise you will not tell the Queen's Grace anything I say." "The Queen's Grace, as you call her," said the prince sternly, "is dead. I killed her myself." "What?" cried the gnome, opening its ridiculous mouth wider and wider in astonishment. "Dead? The witch is dead, and by your honor's hand?" It gave a huge sigh of relief and added, "Why then, your honor is my friend." The prince withdrew his sword an inch or so. Puddleglum let the creature sit up. It looked round on the 4 travelers with its twinkling eyes, chuckled once or twice, and began to tell them. That's the end. of chapter 13. Chapter 14 is called the bottom of the world. I don't know what exactly that means, but does it mean they have to go down before they get back up to the upper world, the overworld? Chapter 14, the bottom of the world. Make sure you come back and listen to that with me.